Let's take a look a little more detail, those three types of muscle. Remember I said I've got three types of muscle? Number one is I've got smooth. If you notice, I said there's always functional units in anatomy. When we talked about bones, we said the function of compact bone is an osteon. When we talk about nerves, we're going to say the function would be a neuron. When we talk about smooth muscle, we're going to have a functional unit. So the functional unit of smooth muscle is going to be organized actin and myosin. So those two protein myofilaments, the organization of them will be the functional unit of smooth muscle. And just think that smooth muscle is really not that well organized because, for example, my intestines are not skeletal muscle. They're not cardiac muscle. They're smooth. First of all, they're involuntary. So I can't tell my small intestine to move something along. I just ate 3 double cheeseburgers, and I can't sit here and say, okay, intestine, I want you to move along and get those cheeseburgers moved out of the stomach and get them into the small intestine and get them into the large intestine, because I can't control them. But even if I could control them, because they just have actin and myosin and that's their functional unit and they don't have sarcomeres, I couldn't tell them to move that bolus of fecal material which came from the cheeseburgers, just as an analogy. I couldn't say, could you move those 3 cheeseburgers 12 inches or 6 inches further along the tract? But yet, if I look at my fingers, I can tell my fingers, hey fingers, I want to take my index finger and would you please move over about an inch? Or would you bring it back about a half inch? I can do that because that's skeletal muscle. I can't do that with my smooth muscle. I also can't do it with my heart. So kind of think the significance of that statement. So smooth muscle, and I think of it where I find it, so it's found in where? Well, I would say blood vessels is a great example. Now there's some exceptions to the rule. As a general rule, all blood vessels are smooth muscle. But you do find some cardiac muscle in the proximal. Remember, proximal means the beginning of portion of 4 vessels. When we get into cardiology in the heart, we'll talk about the great vessels of the heart. And so for today's purposes, remember that those 4 vessels that have some cardiac as they exit the heart are going to be the AA, or the ascending aorta, and the DA, or the descending aorta, and the SVC, which is the superior vena cava, and the IVC, which is the inferior vena cava. And a lot of you might not even know where those structures are at this point. Some of you do. But I always say, it's probably good to teach ahead and also get an understanding of what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it's meaningless. So if I draw this very simple box heart for you, so you'll need to know this for both semesters anyway. If I said this was your heart, and if I divide it into 4 separate chambers, and I'm just going to name those chambers here, looking down at your heart. That's my RA right atrium, RV right ventricle, LA left atrium, LV left ventricle. I know that my heart's got to have blood leaving it to go to my systemic circulation and perfuse my body with oxygenated blood. So since my ventricles are pumping chambers, my left ventricle is going to have a valve that's going to split up and put this out into here. So that's going to be my AA or ascending aorta, and that's my DA or descending aorta. Same thing, I've got to send that blood to my body, to all my cells. There'll be a branch off that ascending aorta going to the cart, and that will branch off into the right and left coronary arteries, and then into the circumflex and the marginal artery and the anterior interventricular and the circumflex. But I've also got to take that blood and perfuse my body, perfuse my heart, but then I got to return that blood back into my heart and start all over again. So coming into my right atrium, I'm going to have 2 great vessels, and that's going to be the SVC, superior vena cava, and the IVC, the inferior vena cava. And just remember, these are chambers here. This is a chamber, so this is heart muscles surrounding that chamber. And if I draw these really as good anatomically as I can to be correct, these great vessels are going directly from the heart muscle. So that's why when I say the proximal portion, so the superior vena cava over here, that's smooth muscle. The inferior vena cava is smooth muscle. Ascending, descending are smooth muscle. But as these SVC and IVC, once they pierce the heart and enter through the myocardium of the heart, they're cardiac muscle. And that will be significant when we start learning about a myocardial infarction or cardiomyopathy or cardiomegaly. Same thing over here. I know that the ascending and descending aorta, once they get away from the heart, are going to be smooth muscle. But as they exit the heart wall, they're going to be cardiac. So that's why I say the exceptions to the rule up here are going to be blood vessels are smooth muscle, except the proximal portion of the AA, DA, SVC, and IVC. Where else do we find smooth muscle? Well, there's a lot of places, but another place it's found would be the uterus. You can't tell your uterus to contract. Your uterus is smooth muscle. It's going to enlarge when the woman's pregnant. It's going to start shrinking when she goes through menopause. It's going to shrink once she delivers the fetus. But at the same time, remember, that's going to be under control of the endocrine system. And so there's going to be hormones like oxytocin. A lot of you are familiar with that because someone would need to induce labor. They would give them a synthetic form called Pitocin. So oxytocin or /Pitocin are going to stimulate uterine contractions and milk ejection. So that tells me that the breast also is going to be smooth muscle. It tells me the uterus is smooth muscle. The same thing with my stomach. My stomach is smooth muscle. Remember I said smooth muscle can undergo hypertrophy and hyperplasia. What's the bad thing about it? I decided that I want to lose weight and I'm going to staple my stomach. Sounds like a great idea. So if this is my stomach and I'm just trying to give you a kind of a big picture here, here's my esophagus passing through my diaphragm, and then here's my stomach. So my stomach's, and again, we'll learn this as we move along through these discourses. We know the stomach's going to have this, what's called a greater and lesser curvature. I'm going to have a fundus. I'm going to have a pylorus. But if I was to staple this stomach off and just say, I'm going to take and staple this stomach right here. I'm going to run a series of staples in here, and I'm only going to let that stomach have so much area, surface area, to hold food. The problem is my stomach is smooth muscle. What does it do? It undergoes hypertrophy and hyperplasia. And sure enough, what will happen is this part of the stomach will just enlarge, and I'll be back to where I started again. Okay? So that's why oftentimes you'll see either you pop the staples or the stomach enlarges again. Same with your colon, my large intestine. All of those structures, think of the large intestine or the colon, LI, large intestine equal colon, or the small intestine, which we'll talk about being the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Those structures are going to be smooth muscle. The only place I'm actually going to see skeletal muscle really in the GI tract is going to be when I swallow. So my pharyngeal constrictors. So as I swallow, and I'm going to have some skeletal muscle of swallowing. But as this works its way through here, I can't tell my stomach to do anything. I can't tell my pyloric sphincter to do anything. And just for, representational purposes, remember from this distal portion of the stomach, I'm going to go to what I would call the small intestine, the SI, which is going to be duodenum, jejunum, ileum. I'm going to go to the colon, or what's referred to as the large intestine, and that's going to be the transverse colon, the ascending colon, the descending colon, the transverse colon, the sigmoid colon. Those are all going to be smooth muscle. I'm not going to see skeletal muscle again until I get to my external anal sphincter. So remember, all of that structure of the GI tract is going to be smooth muscle. Okay? So where else do we see it? Well, we see it like in the bladder. So just like we said small intestine, large intestine, just think of the bladder. I could go on all day with these things. It's just like people think, well, I've got a bladder. Well, let's see. If we just look at the bladder very simply, and when we get to the renal system, as we move on in this next semester's course, we know that the bladder, well, we've got to have a pair of kidneys, so I'm just trying to give you a little gross anatomy here. So here's a kidney sitting over here. There's another kidney sitting over here. And coming out of that kidney is going to be a ureter. And coming that ureter is going to work its way into the bladder, and eventually it's going to end up into the urethra. So just thinking, gross anatomy here and where structures are, which is really important in this class. Just remember that, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but that's a kidney. And this is going to be a ureter. And this is my bladder. And this is my urethra. And then this opening of my urethra is going to be my meatus. And so therefore, I don't have any control at all of my kidneys. I can't say to my kidney, hey kidney, you need to open up that renal pelvis and get rid of some urine. Same thing with my ureter. The ureter's got smooth muscle. I can't say, hey ureter, you need to open up. I need to move some urine on its way. It's going to pass to the ureterovesical junction when we get to the renal system into the bladder. I can't tell my bladder to do anything. It's smooth muscle. It's going to fill up. It's going to have pressure zones. It's going to send nervous control, and it's going to tell me my bladder's full. But I cannot, on my own, tell my bladder to do anything. But I'm eventually going to get to a couple of sphincters, and that's what's going to be somewhere in this region. And I'm just going to oversimplify, and just remember that we're going to have to learn a couple terms when we're talking about muscle called a sphincter. So if we're just talking about the bladder, I'm going to have an internal urethral sphincter. Remember, a sphincter is just defined as closes an opening. But I'm also going to have a sphincter called a external urethral sphincter. The internal is going to be smooth. That pressure wave in my bladder is going to say, I've got to go. But I don't want to go in this room right now. So therefore, I'm going to override that pressure wave of the internal sphincter, and my external sphincter is going to be skeletal muscle. So this sphincter is smooth or involuntary, and this one is going to be skeletal. And therefore, that's going to say, again, it's skeletal muscle, and it's going to say, not here, or not now. So that's the significance. That's why we want to learn the different types of muscle. So we've got some idea of the three types of muscle right now. Again, remember we said we've got skeletal muscle, we've got smooth muscle, and cardiac. Let's just add one more piece to this. You know, when I said you find muscle in a blood vessel, and of course there's, I don't know how many thousands of, probably miles there are of vessels in my body, because you realize I've got these tiny structures called capillaries. But if I looked at a blood vessel and I said, here's a blood vessel, a real kind of a generic drawing of a blood vessel, I know a blood vessel is going to have a lining on the inside. So I'm just going to draw real simply, this blood vessel has a lining. And that lining is going to be called a simple. Remember when you read up on epithelium, it's simple, that means one layered. It's squamous, which means it's flat. And because it's in a blood vessel, it's called an endothelium. But then I've got to have a lumen, so the inside of the vessel is the lumen, or the opening. But if this is a generic blood vessel here, I've got to have some muscle. So surrounding that, I'm going to have some muscle. So this squiggle line is just representing muscle. So these blood vessels, unless they're small capillaries, they're going to have some muscle, and therefore that's going to be smooth muscle. But remember, there's exceptions to the rule I already talked about. Proximal portion of the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, ascending, descending aorta, they're going to, as they enter, exit the heart, are going to have cardiac muscle. And then surrounding that, I'm going to have some connective tissue on a blood vessel. So that's why we use that word CT. And the significance, I just want to make sure you understand here, is that this lining of the blood vessel is called the tunica intima. This middle layer where there's muscle, so this is the tunica intima, or the coat, the internal coat. This is going to be the tunica media. That's going to be muscle. And this is going to be the tunica this is going to be, let me change this. This is the externa. This is the media, and this is going to be the interna or intima. So just to go back and straighten, now make sure you have this correct. If this is a blood vessel, the inside of the blood vessel is the lining or the lumen. It's going to be lined, every blood vessel is going to be lined by a simple squamous endothelium, which is going to be called the tunica interna or tunica intima. Surrounding that is going to be the tunica media, which as a general rule is going to be smooth muscle, except for the proximal portion of the SVC, IVC, AA, and DA. And that's going to be the tunica media. And then surrounding that is going to be the connective tissue like elastin and collagen, which is going to be a tunica externa. Sometimes you'll see, depending on what course you take, or if you go into a higher level histology, they'll call the externa, could also be called the adventitia. So that's the one danger of anatomy, is there's so many times there's words that mean the same. There's different words for this describing the same structure. Let's just take it one more quick example here, and that's looking at someone's uterus, right? Because I said the uterus is smooth muscle. So, if I said here's the body of the uterus, and here's the oviducts or fallopian tubes coming off, and here's the uterus making the fundus of the uterus coming down, and here's muscle, and here's muscle, and here's muscle. So when I'm looking at a uterus, I know that this outer layer is called the parametrium. Remember I said when we talked about muscle, there's something called the paramycium. Remember the paramycium was around muscle bundles or fascicles. The parametrium is the connective tissue covering of the uterus. Then I've got the muscle layer of the uterus, or the myometrium. And then I've got the inside lining, which will just draw this squiggly line here for it. And that's probably everyone's familiar with, because that's called the endometrium. So when we start learning about the reproductive tract, we're going to be thinking about that the uterus is smooth muscle. If we needed to induce delivery, we'd have to give Pitocin, which would cause stimulus to the smooth muscle or uterine contractions. And then once the fetus was delivered, we would have to make sure the placenta came out, which was attached to the endometrium. And then we'll have to also think of the pathology of endometriosis. And that just tells me that's endometrial tissue outside of its normal place, which can be anywhere in the body. I mean, I've even read of cases where endometrial tissue in the neural tube was still open, actually migrated into the neural tube, and every 28 days, the person had bleeding inside of their brain. So that's something we'll talk about once we get into the reproductive tract. The next type of muscle, so we know we've got skeletal muscle, we talked about. We use the gastrocnemius as a great example of that.